I am Elisa Frei and work at the Goethe-Universität Frankfurt and at Boston College. My presentation deals with how the Society of Jesus interpreted and considered Chinese youth in the early modern period. Jesuits were among the first Europeans entering the Chinese Empire and stably living and working there. What makes this particularly interesting today is the fact that they were graphomaniac and wrote extensively about this experience, so we have many accounts on life in the Ming and Qing Empire. What will be analyzed here is the book China by Daniello Bartoli, written in 1663, which is one of his most important and less studied works. A century after the foundation of the Society of Jesus, Bartoli was commissioned to write a complete history of his order, with volumes dedicated to Asia in general, Japan, the Mughal Empire, and also China. There were many other Jesuits, more or less of the same period, who studied the Chinese Empire, and in general they had a high opinion of it, and they thought that its population should just be cultivated with particular patience and efforts. Especially children, once converted, could become a pious example, even better than the one given by European children. The sources analyzed in this paper are European, and they present a partial view of what the Catholic missions in the Ming and Qing Empire were. We must keep in mind that the goal of the Jesuits was, in everything they wrote and did, to convert. They had a certain readership in mind when they wrote their letters, for instance informing their superiors in Europe of how things were going, and another one when their words were elaborated and edited and became then books, like in the case of Bartoli's China. The Catholic Order of the Society of Jesus was founded by Ignatius of Loyola and approved by the Pope in 1540. From the start, the Jesuits engaged in cross-cultural apostolic ministry, benefiting from their close relations with the Spanish and Portuguese Empire. This connection allowed the members of the society to travel to almost every corner of the world, Chinese Empire included. The Society of Jesus was busy mainly in two tasks: education, since they opened many schools all over Europe and also abroad, and missions. Daniello Bartoli is considered the official historian of the Society of Jesus. He was born in Ferrara in central Italy in 1608. He attended Jesuit schools, studied before and then taught logic, physics, metaphysics, philosophy, humanities, rhetoric and theology, and was finally ordained priest. He preached in several Italian cities and always had the dream to become a missionary, but was never chosen for that. As soon as he received the order to write the story of the Society of Jesus, he moved to Rome. From there, he filled thousands and thousands of pages, which is not an exaggeration, until he died in 1685. In Rome, he practically lived in the archive of the order, so he had at his disposal the best sources to work as a historian in a modern sense. This was something that he also complained about. He felt overwhelmed by documents, also because at the time it was particularly hard to manage all those pages, handwritten in different languages, with no translations and so on. What he used were, in a great percentage, letters, written by Jesuit missionaries living in the East, so he had first-hand information. As for his book on China, his main source was Matteo Ricci. Ricci was the first Jesuit who lived in the Chinese Empire, together with Michele Ruggeri. Bartoli also read the translations of Ricci's writing by Nicolas Trigault, and interestingly, since he lived in Rome, he had the chance to talk in person to missionaries and procurators coming from China, which was a sort of oral history of the time. Chinese youth was one of the many topics investigated by Jesuit authors. If one describes lives and customs of China, children play a fundamental role, and this is even more true in the case of missionaries, because children can be one of the most important goals of the Jesuit actions. Converting children could mean converting China, that is, creating a new generation of little Christians who were more interested in the teaching of Jesus Christ than in centuries and millennia of Chinese classics. This is what Jesuits hoped for, and it did not work out very well in the end. Here I listed when Bartoli mentions Chinese youth. He did not do that randomly. Bartoli deals with this topic for precise reasons. First of all, this clearly was something curious that his readers would be interested in reading, so he explained for them, for instance, their hairstyles or their favorite games. The most important angle, however, is for Bartoli to describe how things should and should not be in China. On the one hand, he focuses on how the wrong kind of education creates bad children. On the other hand, since Chinese are smart, diligent, and have a great potential, if they are properly instructed and trained, and if they grow up in the right environment, they can become the best Christians ever. In the Jesuit perspective, this means that the Buddhist and Taoist education is a failure, while the Jesuit one is not only the best, but the only one admissible. We will now read two passages from Bartoli's China concerning youth and then draw some conclusions. The first example is when he describes one of the many moments when Jesuits had trouble not only establishing missions, but simply surviving in such a different world. Bartoli narrated the case of Matteo Ricci, one of the many Jesuits accused of kidnapping Chinese children to sell them to the Portuguese. Two bad men from the neighborhood agreed with a boy that he would play the part of the accuser against the Jesuits, and the two men would intervene in the trial as witnesses, accusing the fathers of kidnapping children. They accompanied the boy and gave him instructions. They messed his hair up so that he looked in great pain. The boy cried many tears. He seemed desperate with such a candor that it could not have looked more real if it had been true, and they both cried desperately, asking revenge against the foreign devils, with a great crowd of people demanding justice to the governor. The boy said that the Jesuits deceived him. They forced him to enter their house and then dragged him into the cellar, tying him up, with the aim of secretly selling him as a slave in Macau, forcing him into that miserable captivity for 3 days, and forcing him to drink the beverage that makes you dumb. So confirmed the fake uncle, and even more effectively the boy, with tears flowing, convincing the witnesses, also because the Portuguese had a reputation of stealing Chinese children to sell them as slaves, which, whether true or not, greatly prejudiced the father's cause. Let's comment this passage after reading another one, in which, on the contrary, we have to deal with a good girl who wanted to convert to Christianity like her family. The father and mother of a 13-year-old virgin had already converted to Christianity, and she was very eager to be baptized too, but they did not allow her to do so because her memory was very hard. No matter how much she studied, she could not memorize the credo prayer. More disconsolate than ever, the girl retired to pray the best she could. While she was doing this, a matron appeared in front of her, majestic and more beautiful than anyone she had ever seen. The girl, shocked or lost, made the sign of the cross, but the woman said, "Do not be afraid, daughter, but go further and say this with me." And then she began, word by word, and the girl repeated it. When they had finished, she said to her, "Go and tell your parents that now they can no longer prevent you from becoming a Christian." And having said this, she disappeared. The girl ran to tell them what she had seen and heard from that woman who was unknown to her, and she realized that she knew the credo perfectly, so her parents did not postpone her baptism any longer, and that divine teacher was believed to be the Queen of the Angels, to whom the father and the mother of the girl were particularly devoted. In these examples, we can find many significant elements. First of all, gender. It is just a case that the boy is bad and the girl is good. Actually, the bad boys are a little more frequent for the simple fact that there were more young boys educated in Buddhist monasteries than girls to become nuns, and the masters of the worst examples for Bartoli are the Buddhist priests. But as for gender in general, boys and girls are treated in a similar way in this kind of hagiographic narrative. We have classic topoi that pertained to the realm of supernatural, which at the time was part of the natural world as well. The fact that Mary appeared to the girl was something that Bartoli's readers would have found pretty normal. Many lives of the Jesuits of the time are full of this kind of interaction between this world and the other. Those who appear are characters of the Christian mythology, and they do not do it gratuitously just to make a scene, but with a very precise aim, which very often is to help the transition from one status to another, to push a young boy to become a Jesuit, or, like in this case, a young girl to find her way to become a Christian. We see then another common trope. If supported by an authoritative figure like Mary, children could become more authoritative than their own parents. The girl thought she was mature enough to convert, the parents did not, but after this miracle, it was the girl's will that prevailed. Going back to the first case, it is clear how this child is a weapon in the battle against the foreigners. The boy in the end was not particularly malignant, but his very malleable mind was corrupted by those wrong influencers. In Bartoli's case, these wrong influencers are often Buddhist monks. In this case, it's normal people who wanted to take economical advantage of the fathers and get rid of them at the same time. If Chinese children are not evil per se, one feature that Bartoli often attributes to them, also in other pages, is their talent to act and fake emotions and express something very different from what they really feel. Finally, at the end of the Bad Boys episode, Bartoli dares to face a very important problem: the intertwining of political and religious interests. Everywhere they went, the missionaries did so because a certain political power, usually the Portuguese and or Spanish Empire, needed their support, which was spiritual and religious, but obviously had and still has a practical and concrete side as well. Jesuits were often intermediator between Europeans and foreign civilizations. They were the only one knowing the languages, being in touch with important people and communicating with both sides. Sometimes they even played an economic role and were involved in trade themselves. The missionaries were religious and, in the case of the Society of Jesus, supranational, but they were automatically seen as associated to the political powers. They arrived in the same ships, they spoke the same languages, they had different interests, but the spiritual and the economic and political aspects were hard to distinguish. In fact, Bartoli concludes that the Portuguese had a reputation of stealing Chinese children to sell them as slaves, which, whether true or not, greatly prejudiced the father's cause. So, having the political support of the Portuguese and Spanish Empire was in a way great for the missionaries and a premise for their every ambition, but it was a double-edged sword. To conclude, Jesuits were very much convinced that children could become great examples of virtue if properly educated, that is, also converted. This was the case also for the Chinese youth, which was born in what was considered and appreciated as a very sophisticated civilization. Concerning that, the Society of Jesus was founded in the era of geographical expansion of the European empires, and Jesuits were happy to become the moral guides not only for the Europeans, but also for the previously unknown and therefore not Christianized populations, especially those who had such a refined culture like China and Japan. As for children, they were one of the most precious targets, because converting children could really mean converting China. Jesuit education was long-sighted and had to start from the new generations to build up a different society. There is no doubt that in the Jesuit sources, the main enemies of the hoped-for moral reform of the empire were the Buddhist and Taoist sects. It was precisely their educational system that led young Chinese mind astray, creating lying, false, and greedy adults. Nevertheless, the controversial and hagiographic key must not silence the fact that, to achieve their goal, the Jesuits analyzed in depth and for a long time the best pre-sinological documentation available at the time. They collected hundreds of pages of notes, the best and first-hand sources, and among them they selected the most worthy and close, chronologically and geographically, to the facts discussed. They interrogated witnesses, workers, travelers, conferers, and usually tried to get as close as they could to the historical truth. However, Jesuit historians were first of all Jesuits, with the preponderant aim of teaching in a Christian way, and, like we see in the case of Bartoli, he assembled all the material he had at his disposal with his imaginative and vibrant style, never forgetting to write something that can be considered enjoyable even today, at least by us scholars.